Good afternoon. My name is Courtney. I am the Facilities Medical Director for Correctional Health Services in the province of Alberta. So I oversee the care of all the inmates who are all the individuals who are incarcerated in Alberta in provincial systems. I also have a background in cross-cultural psychiatry. I've worked in the past with Mosaic, and I've worked did my training in cross-cultural psychiatry at the University of Minnesota, which has one of the model programs probably in the world for dealing with refugees and victims of torture. I've been asked to make a few comments about not so much the medical model for treating refugees and individuals who are immigrating into the country, but kind of beyond that, the medical model. What else is needed to make acculturation or moving into a new country successful? And there's lots of articles that are out there. There's lots of models and paradigms of how to do this. I think the most important part is training our staff, training ourselves in how to work with individuals who are coming from other countries and moving to Canada. Just a little background on this. Right now, throughout the world, in 2019, there are about 80 million displaced individuals in the world, right? Most of those individuals tend to flee either in country, so I'm going from one city to another to escape most often war or political persecution. The other vast majority of those guys do not go far from their country. So, for instance, in Syria, many people moved to Lebanon, which caused a bit of a crisis for Lebanon, when you've got massive people flowing in. A small portion of those individuals do go further away, and Canada accepts those individuals. So just to give you an idea, Canada in 2019 resettled 30,000 refugees. More than any of the other 26 countries volunteering to accept refugees. What's happened with that is we get this influx, and from experience working at the Mosaic, when I worked at the Mosaic Clinic, it becomes a bit overwhelming sometimes for local agencies when these individuals come in. Because there's a lot to do. You know, there's not just medical issues which are critical. There are housing issues. There are education issues. There are even dealing with folks with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that have come from war-torn countries, and there needs to be good case management, and that's got to be comprehensive. One of my I have a friend who treats ADHD, and as a psychiatrist, and very typically, if I go in with ADHD and I get diagnosed with it, I get a prescription, and I go home, right? And that prescription is really only about 50 to 70% effective, because the other half of that is all the other things that go with having ADHD. So needing to change the way I spend time online, needing to change the way I interact at meetings, needing to change the way I think about certain things. I would say that's not dissimilar with refugees, people coming in from other countries. Health needs are critical. The mental health needs are critical, but it has to come as a package. And that package also includes feeling safe, particularly if you come from a war-torn country where for the last 5-10 years you haven't felt safe, where you've been tortured, where there's been where you've had family disappear that you never see again. And it becomes, for these individuals, those issues have to be addressed. If you want the medication to be helpful, if you want how we treat individuals medically or psychiatrically to be successful, you've got to take into consideration all the other life issues that are going on for these individuals. I want to discuss some of the things that do not help with acculturation, that do not help with moving and adapting to a new country. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about those, and then I want to move on to things that might be more helpful in doing that. So individuals that I have a particular interest in child soldiers, and the presentation that I did last year for this conference focused on that. So there is a little bit of overlap. However, it extends now to families and sometimes multi-generational family systems. As we're able to bring over children, parents, grandparents, extended relatives like aunts and uncles. So some of the factors that have a negative effect on refugees or acculturation and adapting to a new country. Certainly no contact with your family of origin. At the Mosaic Clinic, there are a lot of individuals from the Yazidi group. And those individuals, once they move here, they spend a great deal of time wondering and obsessing, and rightfully so, about how do I bring other family members over? Where are family members that have disappeared? And they sit and they hold out hope for, and I worked with one gentleman, and he spent his entire day with another group of Yazidi men, and all they did all day long was sit on the internet, looking at videos, looking to see, maybe that's my son, maybe that's my, and so they would bring up any video they could find, and they were, I don't want to say trapped in it, but there is a sense that they are not able to move on, right? No access to your culture of origin. When individuals move to Canada with it, typically in the bigger cities like Calgary, there are other individuals, right? So from the same country you're from, and that's a positive factor. Individuals who move, I've seen this with some of the individuals. I had a young incarcerated male, and he was from a country in Africa. He knew nobody else from that country, right? And that factors, there's no support in that for him. His family wasn't here. He had immigrated here alone, right? Another factor is access to education when individuals come here. Otherwise, you get really limited. You get stuck, right? And you've got, even if it's as basic as learning to read, for first-generation refugees, being able to finish school, being able to go to college, is critical in being able to adapt and move on. Certainly employment over time, it's usually not an initial issue, because there is the issue of your refugee status, obtaining permanent residence, then obtaining citizenship over time. But employment has a real sense of self-worth for individuals as well. People who come over who feel helpless, that's something that has to be dealt with. You're helpless, there's this immense sense of helplessness. Your life has been disrupted for years. You're now in a country where everybody's offering you help. But we have to really listen to what those individuals want for help at that point in time. And some of the folks that I've worked with in the past, it's very hard when your life has been unsafe and threatened for 5 to 10 years to just come to a country with a different climate, a different group of people that don't speak your language, that don't share your culture, and then to feel safe, right? Very early in my career, I worked with young men who were tortured in Bosnia during the conflict. And there was this overriding paranoia that how can you guarantee me that this isn't going to happen again? One of the things, and we can't, right? I mean, relatively safety, we can say that. But, what do you actually say to be able to do that? I ended up running groups for these individuals that really weren't so much focused around mental health issues. They were really focused on connecting and listening to their stories, a type of therapy that's called narrative therapy. Because for them to move on, they have to not look over their shoulder. They have to feel that they can go into a mall, go into a store, and feel safe. Individuals with an immense amount of anger, struggle very hard to acculturate to a new culture. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of I want to be, and the vast majority of refugees, they don't want to leave their country. They want to be back in their country, back with family, back where they're comfortable. And individuals who are intensely angry, and you see these not just in men, but in particularly in young men who experience this, have experienced this level of torture. In the work that I've been involved with child soldiers, I typically see them when they're teenagers or young adults. And one of the things I look for is the degree of actual, resentment and anger from what's happened to them in the past. And the worse that is, the more difficult it is to get help those individuals move into a new country successfully. Feeling lonely or isolated, which makes sense, and which I kind of mentioned earlier, it's much safer to be able to come to a country where there are other people like you. And it's interesting, when refugees move to a country, they often don't have a choice as to what city they go to. Sometimes they do, many times they don't. Once they're established, you'll see this kind of migration. So if there are more of a certain population living in Toronto, I'm going to be more comfortable there. And so after they've been here, after they've settled, they tend to migrate to other countries. Within the country to other cities where there are other communities. Those are looking at the difficulties of acculturation, right? What are some of the positive factors and the protective factors? And these are things that we really stress in terms of success, becoming successful in your new environment. And it's obvious. It's just the opposite of what I just talked about, right? But let me go through some of them individually. So people who do better are people who certainly migrate from less violent communities, as you might suspect, from less war-torn communities. People who have fewer levels of survivor guilt. This is a big issue. Again, at the Mosaic Clinic, we see a lot of Yazidi folk, and there's immense survival guilt. I'm here, and either my family is still there, or my family can't be here, right? And if the family's there and there's an ability to communicate with the family, facilitating that contact is helpful. However, it doesn't get the family here. And there's this kind of survivor guilt that I'm in Canada, and I'm not even sure I deserve to be here because I don't know where my son is. I don't know where, I know my family is still there and they could be attacked anytime. So there's the more survival guilt, the more difficult it is. That group of men that I was talking about earlier that sit around all day looking on the internet to see, reading every story about, the Syrian, about ISIS. You get stuck. And there is a real sense that you've got to go to them to start, right? You've got to hear their story, and you almost have to experience what they're doing in terms of being, sitting on that internet all day long to be able to slowly move folks on. Because the chances are you won't see your relative. You're not going to see your relatives chasing the internet. Folks that have more spiritual support do better. Doesn't matter what kind of spiritual support, right? Even if it's humanism. But individuals that are attached to a certain faith, attached to a certain ideology, tend to do better when they move to new countries, and that should be fostered. Any connection to family of origin I've already addressed. Some of the youth that move into new countries don't have families. They come on their own. We see this with some of the African males that come from like Sudan, some of the younger males, some of the males from war-torn countries, Syria in particular. They end up in adopted families. As critical as it is to work with the child, I think it's just maybe even more critical at times to work with the family, because they don't know what to expect. They don't know how to deal with the anger, the nightmares that may occur, the outburst that occur, and what to do about the past trauma that's involved. There's a system of therapy that's become very popular, trauma-informed therapy, and we train healthcare trained staff to deal with that. In fact, in the jails and prisons in the province, we've trained corrections officers how to identify trauma and how to interact with inmates. And I'm a very large advocate that if you're going to be an adoptive parent for somebody who comes from a war-torn country, you should have the same training. You should know exactly what to look for. You should know when to ask for help. You should know how to intervene. And sometimes know when to not intervene. Anger is, in and of itself, is not a bad thing. Anger that escalates, anger that continues over time, becomes detrimental. The other thing with adopted families and with individuals who work with other cultures, and now I'm speaking about Canadians in particular, is we can't be expected not to know their culture. So when you're working with individuals and they come to this country, I believe there needs to be an assessment that goes way beyond medicine. And I'm not faulting medicine. People who have been physically tortured have multiple ongoing pain syndrome. They have multiple psychiatric and psychic illnesses. I'm not minimizing those, but you've got to put kind of a collective picture around. When we do our cultural assessment, it's critical that you look at the factors that are protective, that you kind of stack those up. You look at the ones where they lack that protection, and your plan should really focus, I believe your plan should really focus on how do you boost those negative, take those negative and move up to a positive section, right? It's very difficult for me, I'll use high blood pressure as a good example. Individuals with high blood pressure don't feel it. Most of us never have symptoms from it. Yes, it'll affect us later in life. It could eventually kill us, but in the here and now, it's meaningless. So I come from a culture where I don't understand taking a pill every day. If I need a pill, I go to somebody and they give me an antibiotic or pill, and I go home and I'm done, right? And then, what I'm hearing, as a physician is, it's not important, and so why would I, compliance is not there for folks. The follow through is not there because I've got more important things on my mind. I've got to get back home so I can get in front of the internet. And there's this sense that you're taking up my time, right? So when we do cultural assessments, you take a look at the protective factors, you take a look at the negative factors, and how can I change and mitigate those. You work very closely, make sure that people who are working with these individuals are trained in the culture. One of the more successful refugee programs in the US is in Portland, Oregon. And they spend an immense amount of time training. They have I don't know if they still do, they used to have a very large population, as in Minnesota, of the Hmong people who are persecuted by Pol Pot in Cambodia. And they spend as much time working with the therapist and the support workers in terms of making sure they understand the culture and making sure they recognize when someone is not coping and when someone is not adapting. I want to say they spend as much time with those individuals, and maybe even more, than they spend with the patient, or with the person, with the refugee, excuse me. And I think that's critical. If you don't understand a certain cultural syndrome, if you don't understand a certain cultural importance, working with, I worked with Russian Jews when they first came to the U.S., and they couldn't escape the government. They could not escape communism. And there was this global paranoia with these individuals. There was you couldn't get these individuals to open bank accounts, right? Because what happened in the Soviet Union, you open a bank account, somebody comes and takes your money away. It may take 5 years, 10 years, but you lose everything. And in the US and Canada, you can't do a hell of a lot without a bank account, right? And I would get the social workers, working with these individuals who will come in, and they would say, you must tell them to open a bank account. And I would go talk to the family, talk to the father, And he's like, you don't understand. Somebody's going to take my money. It may not be today. So you had families with $75,000 in their mattress. I'm not exaggerating, right? Yeah, because they were hardworking individuals. They wanted to do well, but this lingering kind of paranoia from the government stuck with them, right? So we had to backtrack and work with the social workers to get them to understand what this was about. So I'm a huge advocate for, you have to understand, you and all of your staff have to understand the culture. So kind of the take-home message here, obviously, is we don't just treat the refugee, right? We certainly, if there is medical illness, if there is psychiatric illness, we provide that service, right? And in a culturally sensitive way. But I also think we treat the individuals who work with the refugees, right? Vicarious trauma. It's very hard to sit and listen to a woman who has been raped repeatedly. And there's been more than once that I've cried on the way home, right? Yeah, you've got to be sensitive to this, your staff. You've got to make sure they understand that culture. They recognize the signs and symptoms. They've got to be willing to get out of the office and go to where those individuals are at times to make this successful. That cultural training, by the way, on a bigger term, and I'll end with an area that I work in right now, is I work in jails and prisons. And we're seeing an influx of certain populations, North African males at this point in time, that are coming into jails. Many of them are not being arrested on major crimes. It's burglaries, and there's this kind of, there's very little support for these individuals. They come from war-torn countries. Some of them themselves are child soldiers, and when they needed something in their country, they took it, particularly child soldiers, right? And they come here, and they see me driving my car. I'm a rich doctor, right? And I asked one guy, one individual one time, why are you doing this? Do you keep committing these crimes? And he goes, Canadians are rich. They won't miss it. They can buy something. They can replace it. And it was kind of an aha moment for me, because I don't want my car stolen. But there really was this attitude, and we talked a long time about it. Is that accurate or not? He was a child soldier at the time. He had an immense amount of issues around anger, as you might guess. He's ripped away from his family, given a gun, and told to go fight, right? And from that day on, anything he wanted, he took. Right? And so understanding his story, and my point with this is, the more we work with refugees, we're actually getting quite good in the mental health realm of doing this, in the medical realm of doing this, in the social work realm of doing this. But there's also a whole other aspect of this, and that's the lawyers, the legal system, the police who interact with these individuals, the caseworkers. Caseworkers actually do quite well for the most part. But the police who stop you on the street and ask you what you're doing, I think they need two things. I think they need, like we're doing with all the corrections officers, some trauma-informed care, understanding what that's about. I think they also need an understanding of how to work with different cultures, right? And don't get me wrong, it's impossible. I mean, I tried to look up the number of different types of refugees that come to Canada. I don't know the cultures. I've done a lot of work in the past with Arab cultures, with Soviet Jews, with Bosnian refugees, but I know little or nothing about Sudanese individuals until I started asking those questions and hearing their story. It's a very isolated group of mostly young men. So my take-home message is two things. One, when you do your assessment, it has to be as global as possible, looking at positive, negative protective factors. The second part is we've got to make sure that we've educated the individuals who encounter refugees. And I think it's critical. And I don't think that means that you have to become an expert in every culture that you deal with. It's the approach that you take to the individual that research seems to support makes the difference.